Hi, I'm Ros Bullied, Research and Policy Director at Green Alliance. Welcome to this webinar discussing whether we can have a thriving and green chemical sector in the UK and how we achieve that. Chemicals manufacturing has been an area of focus for us at Green Alliance over the last couple of years. This webinar follows on from a briefing we published last year looking at the barriers to developing a future-proofed, defossilised chemical sector in the UK and how they're being addressed by policy. But it's really timely too, unfortunately. When we published the briefing, we noted that the sector's output had fallen by 9% and employment by 7%, and that was just in the last year. And the risks facing the sector were reinforced earlier this month by the closure of INEOS's synthetic ethanol plant at Grangemouth and accompanying media questions and comments around the future of the chemical sector. As an industry that not just uses fossil fuels to create heat, but also as its raw material, chemical manufacturers are particularly exposed to high energy prices. But those characteristics also mean that it should be a priority for climate action. Chemicals manufacturing will have to eventually move beyond fossil fuel use and develop greener chemicals to survive. And it would be better for the UK to be able to retain a healthy chemicals industry and be at the forefront of that innovation. I should also quickly add a side note on terminology for those of you like me, without chemistry degrees. We talk all the time about industrial decarbonisation, and I may use that at times for chemicals too. Apologies in advance to any experts out there who wince at the term. Obviously, we actually can't and wouldn't want to really take the carbon out of chemicals themselves. So that's not a particularly helpful term, which is why we do tend to use defossilisation. Our briefing, which is imaginatively named Policy Barriers to Greening the Chemicals Industry, if you want to find it on our website, found that for the chemical industry to flourish in the transition to a safer climate, it needs to attract investment into greener feedstocks, cleaner processes, skills and training. Policy is progressing on carbon capture and on hydrogen, and actually a bit on innovation too. That's not a bad area, but was assessed as much less promising in a suite of other areas where it's needed to stimulate investment, including electrification, resource efficiency, alternative feedstocks and skills. This all matters as chemicals and their derivatives are ubiquitous. They're used in over 90% of manufactured products and materials, including plastics, fertilizers and detergents. It also matters because the UK's chemical sector provides around 140,000 highly skilled jobs, and a lot of those are actually located outside London and the southeast. Our briefing suggests a suite of policy measures to bridge the gaps, but I'm sure our really expert panel that I'd like to welcome next will have thoughts of their own. Welcome, and thanks to all of them for helping us think about how the UK might navigate this really complex challenge. I'll turn to each of them in turn to say a few words, and then we'll have a discussion before opening it out to questions from the floor. First up is Darren Budd from BSF, who kindly sponsored our work on the briefing. Darren has worked for BSF since 1996 in a variety of different roles and sits on the board of several trade associations too. His current focus is on the development of BSF UK and Ireland strategies to deliver the company's growth ambitions. And he's going to reflect on the briefing and the factors holding back chemical manufacturers in the UK from investing in net zero solutions. Thanks, Darren. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ros, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I think in terms of, first I want to start in terms of that defossilization, decarbonisation debate. I think we just need to understand is how do we get carbon out of the system? We're all made of carbon chemicals in terms of how do we do that. But I think the challenge from a chemical company point of view is how do we move to a net zero environment? We still need to make the chemicals that we have today, but in a net zero way. So in terms of, and a big part of that, what the Green Alliance put into their paper was the cost of energy. Because to make chemicals, it costs money, and we've got to use that energy. So how do we get the cost down of that? So in terms of that electrification, so how do we electrify? So rather than using gas or oil to power our plants, how do we electrify our plants? And that's also a big challenge to make sure that cost of energy, and the cost of energy in the UK is high, to make sure that we have the right cost to make our products that go into all the products we use, whether it's in automotive, whether it's in food, whether it's in plastics, that actually we're not putting up the cost of products and therefore driving an increase in the cost of living. So that's a really big challenge in terms of getting those costs right. And part of that challenge in terms of when we look at that is how do we take CO2 out of the environment, or utilizing the CO2 that we have? So in terms of making sure, and when we look at that in terms of that, the cost of chemicals, in terms of making new chemicals or making existing chemicals from existing resources, is in terms of how do we take fossil fuels out of this, or virgin fossil fuels out of this chain? And part of that is then the different parts of that supply chain. So in terms of where do we get our carbon from? Because a lot of the the chemicals that we produce in terms of have carbon as a backbone in terms of, so can we take existing in terms of the circularity, can we take existing products, make them circular, and actually then put them back into the supply chain in terms of that getting carbon from existing materials and having a circular economy or circular materials that we can then take, say, plastics, put them back into oil, put them into our steam cracker. Therefore, we're not using virgin materials in terms of doing that. But in terms of and energy, as I talked about as a first, comes into that. So it's a very energy intensive process in terms of whether to build a new plant or whether to run an existing plant, and actually how do we utilize that properly. And also in terms of people say, well, why can't we use natural resources? But then there's the playoff in terms of if we're using plant, are we using food resources that we would use in terms of, or agricultural land for chemical production in terms of natural materials or resource materials, or do we use it for food? So it's always a playoff in terms of, but we can use biomass. That's also another source of carbon that we can as an alternative feedstock for that. And then captured carbon. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard about carbon capture, utilization, storage. So how do we capture that carbon dioxide, and then also in terms of generating green hydrogen to make the chemicals that we need for today. So we're working on projects, but they take a long time, and that goes into then the innovation side. Is what do we need? What do we need to use to develop products we have today in terms of from innovation at universities into startup companies, that we can then take those technologies and build them out into new processes to make chemicals for the future or existing chemicals from new processes. But this also in terms of takes a long time. We take in terms of early stage research in terms of what we call transition readiness levels from level 0 to level 9, where we make then our processes and we make the chemicals we have. So it's always a big challenge to do this in terms of everything takes time, everything takes resources, everything takes money. And in terms of how long does that take to get from where we are today to a fully net zero, well, whereas we've set targets of, say, getting to 2050 net zero, but in terms of when will that happen? Will it happen now? When will people see the existing products or new products which are coming out? But also in terms of people don't want to pay more for those products. So in terms of how do we develop them at a cost efficient way to make sure that we have the products for the future or green products for the future without utilizing existing resources, or making sure we utilize existing resources but in a cost efficient manner. And then to make all these products in terms of develop these new technologies, have the innovation, is do we have the right people, do we have the right skills in place? And therefore that going back in terms of into schools, into universities, to make sure that we have the skill challenge, or we upskill the current generation or the new generation to make sure we have the skills for the new technologies, the new processes that we want to develop for the future. So in terms of Ross, that's just in terms of a brief background in terms of that. There's a lot more behind it, but in terms of, yeah, and we could take some of those questions as we move forward.
Thank you. Yes, no, that's really helpful. That's started with a good list of challenging questions and ideas, and I'm sure we will come back to some of those later. Just a reminder as well for people that in the audience that there's a discussion board where you can, or Q&A board where you can post questions as well if you want to put them to any particular members of the panels, or members of the panel, or just more generally. Please put them in there. Next up, we're going to hear from John Story. John's from the TUC, and he joined their worker-led transition team in June 2024. He began his career in the chemicals industry, working in product development and manufacturing, before moving on to other trade union roles focused around worker-led transition and policies to sustain jobs while decarbonising. John's going to give us some insights from his work at the TUC and from chemical industry workers.
Thanks, Ros, and yeah, thanks for the invite. And yes, I definitely have a special interest in this, having worked in the industry before this current job. So I work for the TUC on a new project called the Worker-Led Transition Project. So this was set up to make sure that the voices of workers in high carbon industries are heard as we move towards net zero. So I'm one of 4 project officers, and we've also got policy officer and TUC policy leads. So at the heart of our project are some key principles, which is first of all, future-proofing action plans negotiated with workers and their unions, either at site or sector level, government investment and support in infrastructure, and a national just transition commission to ensure no one's left behind. Or to put it a different way, plans to make sure that jobs are still here in 20 years' time. What do we need to do? Because if we don't do it right, we risk widespread job losses and a breakdown in trust from workers and communities. So, take, for example, the recent announcement about Grangemouth, but it also applies to other oil refineries. So we've seen the closure announcements, hundreds of direct skill jobs going, many more associated jobs, and a huge negative impact on the local community. We've seen that across oil refineries, so several have closed over the last decade. Now, we know that there's clearly going to be a drop in demand for petrol and diesel, and we've seen disintegration of refineries from associated chemical plants. And if we don't have alternatives, these closures will continue. Now, I know a number of the workers at Grangemouth and other sites that have closed, and for years they've been calling for investment in alternatives to help them manage the transition away from fossil fuels. But to be blunt, there's been very, very little action, and these workers feel really left down. I think to just sort of segue slightly into potential jobs in the future and skills. So it's very clear from numerous industry surveys that there's ongoing gaps in STEM-related jobs and ability to fill them, and a lot of competition between different sectors. At the same time, there's been a decrease in the amount that is being spent on employee training, and I think also some negative perceptions of the industry. I think even though, obviously we support the increase in number of graduates and apprenticeships in the industry, but also even if every single graduate went into the industry, there still wouldn't be enough. And I think what's not looked at enough is how we can retrain existing workers to do these jobs. Obviously not in every case, but an example from another sector, it's perfectly possible to retrain someone who worked in a coal-fired power station to work in offshore and onshore wind. What we need to do there is to remove the burden from the individual worker and really understand from their point of view what the barriers are and how we can mitigate them. So how are they going to pay their mortgage if they're having to fund their own training and leave the current employment? There's a bit of a shopping list here, but it would include things like recognisable, transferable qualifications, funding, robust agreements to train well in advance of any job change, and I think wherever possible, having the chance to try out new roles before fully transitioning. I'll just move on to the wider society. So for decades, trade unions have been advocating for a proper plan to ensure no one gets left behind in the transition to a net zero economy. So we've seen the devastating impacts of poorly managed transitions in the past. Coal would be a classic one, but more recently steel. And I think from a worker's point of view, promises of green jobs haven't materialised. So there's the immediate impact on the workforce and the local community. There's also the very real risk of losing consent for net zero and the potential backlash from that, and the risk of populist but divisive voices being amplified. So to sort of try and wrap it up a bit, what does a just transition from a worker's point of view look like? So one part is it's making sure that any green jobs in the future, they're not just available, but they're also secure and well paid and unionised. What's really important is that workers' voices are heard in future plans, and not just as a mitigation after plans have already been announced, but being involved before decisions are made. We'd certainly like a Just Transition Commission set up like they have in Scotland, and that sort of integration, interaction with UK industrial strategy. So it's not enough to just assume that growth in certain sectors will automatically lead to good jobs. There needs to be policies to make that happen as well. So, for example, in the offshore wind industry, that's clearly grown a lot over the last decade, but it's not necessarily led to a significant increase in local jobs or supply chains. I think Darren touched on this earlier in his talk, enabling infrastructure. So we know in the chemical industry, also, Green Alliance have written some really good reports on this. A lot of processes can be electrified, but there's cost and connection issues need to be addressed before that can happen. So just finally, why are we doing this project? So we're not just set it up because it's nice to have. Involving the workforce is vital if we're going to transform the industry and halt the decline and have a vibrant future. Workers have got a lot of untapped knowledge that's needed. Also, to paraphrase a cliche, the workforce that plays an integral role and has good employment conditions and whose voice is not just heard but acted on is a productive workforce. I'll just finish by saying what we really need is a good example. There's lots of really good research work on possibilities for jobs in the future, but we're not seeing this in reality at a large enough scale. So we need to be able to show that jobs are moving to net zero are mutually supportive and not in conflict. And having a few good examples can act as a catalyst and show a pathway that can protect jobs and the environment. But the longer we take in doing this, the more difficult it will be. I'll stop now and look forward to any questions later. Thanks.
Thanks so much, John. It's really helpful to have that reminder of the importance of workers in this process, and also that risk of backlash against net zero. That's definitely something we're very concerned about too. Finally, I want to turn to our third panelist. Rachel Armstrong is the Director for Industrial Decarbonisation and Emissions Trading in the Government's Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. In her role, Rachel works with business, industry, other bits of government, and obviously with the devolved authorities as well, and towards delivery of a thriving net zero economy. Rachel joined the civil service in 2022 after spending 20 years in the private sector. Not to put too much pressure on you, Rachel, but obviously we've already raised quite a few issues, so it would be really good to hear where the government's thinking is on industrial decarbonisation, and obviously there's the forthcoming industrial strategy too, so it'd be really useful to kind of hear how all of this might come together in the industrial strategy.
Hey Ros, and thanks everybody for inviting me and having me. Hopefully it is clear, but let me state it anyway, right? So the government is really committed to supporting industry in the decarbonisation journey. It's where we see the future. It is about protecting thousands of jobs in different regions across the UK and enhancing Britain's position, right, as a leading industrial nation. I'm speaking to you from Manchester. And this whole point about how do we enable the country to take advantage of the new opportunities and promoting growth and promoting wealth creation is fundamentally what this is all about. I would like to thank the Green Alliance for your very thoughtful conclusions in the policy barriers to greening the chemical industry paper. As it does set out, it is about how do we directly reduce the emissions in the chemical industry? And that isn't just the fuel emissions, right? It is the defossilization of the feedstocks. That has to be where the future is going. And a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with the chemical product life cycle are a result of breakdown at end of life. So compared to things like the products from refining, where a lot of those products go up in, you get the greenhouse emissions majority from combustion, all of those embodied emissions from sort of cradle to grave, the whole life cycle view needs to be addressed from a chemicals perspective because of that breakdown at end of life. And that does mean that we need to be taking a serious view about what is sustainable in terms of biomass. I recognise my fellow panelists' comments about how does that conflict with food. It's got to look at chemical recycling or captured carbon, and that is a priority for unlocking emission savings because 90% of chemicals globally are using fossil feedstocks. It is a massive challenge, so of course we do need to start now. and I would like to raise a couple of points, right? So some of the defossilization policies are underway. I think it comes up in the report, but HMT have now announced that a mass balance approach will be applied to the plastic packaging tax discounts, and that should encourage plastic manufacturers to increase the amount of recycled plastics in their products, particularly those that are going through the chemical recycling route. And that's clearly a nascent industry in the UK, right? So we need to get an early lead in developing that, and scaling that up will be a vital source of more sustainable carbon to enable the chemical industry to defossilize. You'll notice that we're trying to talk about defossilization rather than just decarbonisation, because decarbonisation is more what do you do about the fuel side. The government's also supported innovation projects. So I know this is the beginning bit, right? But the 30 million National Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Research Programme and the 66 million Transforming Foundational Industries Innovation Challenge both included funding for chemical companies. And that also included 2.7 million for the Flutichem project that is referenced in the report, which is really exciting, right? This collaborative industry-wide project looking at how do you unlock sustainable carbon through industrial carbon capture. So we are looking at how we can continue to best provide support for innovation going forwards. When we look at the process emissions, there's been a number of actions taken to support the transition, right? So this includes the carbon pricing, which is about how do you also have the investment signal for decarbonisation, and of course the free allocations under the emissions trading that have been there to support and protect against carbon leakage. We do not currently have any plans for including chemicals other than fertilisers in the UK CBAM. Right, and I know that's something that people might want to talk about. It is something that we're going to keep under review as a potential way to help the sector transition with remaining internationally competitive, but it is computationally quite challenging. So we're also very open to any insights that you have there. And we have, of course, announced, I'm sure you haven't missed it, right, the 21.7 billion of funding available over the next 25 years to launch the UK's carbon capture and storage industry, which is going to be important in reducing hard to abate emissions, and that for us also includes the chemical sector. And I think cannot be overstated. I saw it in the chat as well, somebody asking, effective decarbonisation of the UK chemical sector is going to need some fuel switching, right? And I think we will be seeing increasing in the future questions about how electrification of heat can be achieved alongside obviously low carbon fuels like hydrogen, but electrification is going to be an essential component to the transition. And as I say that, I'm very cognizant of how high or how relatively high the UK electricity prices are. They are expensive. There's a lot of uncertainty in predicting future prices, but under the current pricing system, we expect electricity prices to come down as we source more of the fuels from the renewables, right? And that'll protect us from some of the fossil fuel price spikes. And it is core part of why the department I work in is on the national mission, which is championed by the Prime Minister, to get to 95% clean power by 2030. There is some support in place to keep heavy industry competitive. So given the total impact on energy and climate change policies on industrial electricity prices, there is support for eligible energy intensive industries like chemicals, and that is includes the compensation for the indirect emissions cost of the ETS and carbon price support, and reductions in the indirect costs for contracts with difference and the renewable obligations and the small scale feed-in tariffs. I think you should also keep a close eye on what's going on with hydrogen as a feedstock and low carbon fuel. So both, particularly in the high temperature processes, right? So where we may struggle to or not have enough demonstrated scale for the high temperature process for electrification. And we are working on the policy and regulatory framework to enable that. And then maybe just to say something about next steps as well, right? So industrial strategy, obviously very visible. And in there's also the pieces around what are the foundational industries that will support the industrial strategy. As I said at the beginning, this is very much about protecting jobs and enabling growth. We're going to work very closely and continue to work very closely with DEFRA and the Department of Business and Trade to work to deliver on our objectives for a zero waste circular economy. Right? And Green Alliance is represented on the government's new circular economy task force. And we're working on that to ensure we're developing a strategy that supports the development of net zero aligned circular transition pathways across a wide range of products and materials. Right? So I think those are kind of really important things. You can see the circular economy coming through in the manifesto. You can see the industrial strategy, and you can see the focus also mayoral regions and how we're supporting jobs and growth are very high on the political agenda. I guess there's a piece as well where I should thank everybody for those who contributed to the industrial strategy green paper through offering their comments last year. And we are going to be publishing a refresh of the UK's industrial decarbonisation strategy on the same timeline as previously. So we said we would do it every 5 years, and that's what we're expecting to do. So watch this space on that one. And we really welcome continued engagement, right? Because this has to be a joint effort and making sure that we really understand where the challenges are and what policy will actually support the transition of the sector. But as I said, and as Ross said at the beginning, chemicals is so fundamental to high quality of life in the 21st century. And we are very conscious that it isn't just a decarbonisation challenge, but also a defossilisation of the feedstocks piece. So much to do, and 2050 is not that far away. So that's what we'll be working on, and looking forward to your input. I think I'm going to stop there, Ross.
Thank you, Rachel. And it's great to hear you kind of recognise some of the challenges and some of the issues that others have raised, and that those are on your agenda. Also, I get very excited about those things like the Flue-to-Chem project as well. I think there's some really exciting things happening in kind of various places. I guess, as John was saying, there's the kind of next stage that we need to get to as well, but there's definitely some good things going on too. And also it was really encouraging, I think, to see quite a few of these things referenced, or these issues referenced in the industrial strategy green paper. That was something we'd welcome, and we're really excited about the forthcoming circular economy strategy. So there's loads to be kind of looking forward to as well. And yeah, I'm sure that government is kind of keen to get cracking on some of this, but and very much welcome as well from the rest of the kind of NGO sector, and I'm sure from industry colleagues, in how we can feed in the kind of invitation to feed into that too. With that in mind, I want to bring everyone back into the John and Karen back into the conversation too, please, and then we'll have there's a couple of questions that I was going to ask you more generally, and then we'll go to the audience for some questions as well. I've seen a few come in, so plenty to choose from. Some nice knotty questions as well. I mean, the first question I was wondering is whether you've got a clear vision of what the future UK chemicals industry might look like. Are there kind of particular areas we might want to lean into? Would the product mix look the same at the end of it as well? What to you does success look like, I suppose, is the question. I don't know who wants to kick off.
I'll go, Ros, in terms of where does that look like. I suppose if we still need the same chemicals, we'll probably still need the same chemicals tomorrow as we have today. It's really in terms of the mix is where do we get the raw materials from for the future, and in terms of can we make them, as I said, can we make them cost effectively, in terms of so making sure we utilize. So I think circularity plays a big part. Is how do we then use circularity in terms of reusing the products we have today to, as rather than characterize it as waste, characterize it as raw materials, and actually getting the processes to put it back into our chemical plants that we have today. So to build a fully integrated site is really expensive, but can we retrofit those sites that we have to use the recycled materials or the new chemicals, so carbon from carbon capture or hydrogen to make the products that we have today in a sustainable and cost-effective way.
Thank you. John, any thoughts on what success might look like from your perspective?
Yeah, so I certainly agree with what Darren just said then. I think it would be impossible to talk about the entire industry in this webinar because it's so complex and diverse. But I think if I was going to start somewhere, it would be very much at the, can we make some of the building block chemicals that are vital for making things further down the value chain in a more sustainable way? I mean, the answer technically is yes, we can, but we need, you know, we need the investment in infrastructure to be able to do this. And I think certainly initially, you know, maybe supporting for increased energy costs, for example. But if you just think of a couple of examples, methanol, really important basic chemical. I don't think we actually make any in the UK at the moment. It's projected to grow significantly over the next decades. It's possible to make that in a sustainable way. I think some other countries are starting it. It's something that we could do, and if we did do it, you know, I think it would have a really beneficial effect. I think be slightly off subject as well. The other thing, because of I think there's a few comments in the Q&A. It's also, I think, also looking at the role of some of the chemicals that are made in the journey towards net zero. So just a very simple example: you can't make wind turbine blades without chemicals, and they play a really important role in their effectiveness. So it's also looking at those as well.
Thank you.
Rachel, could I just come back on in terms of when we're talking about methanol, in terms of when we talked about the flue to chem process that we have in terms of the project that's running, and if I go back to John's point on that, on methanol. So what we have shown from that process is the carbon capture, and there was a question on carbon capture. And so in terms of utilizing that at a foundation industry, so in terms of paper chemicals manufacturers, so, and actually you could then put a distributed manufacturing site to capture, once you've captured that carbon, and you have then a hydrogen source coming in to actually then make methanol. So we've shown that we can make an alcohol from carbon dioxide in the process, which is then you can then if you've got the right catalyst to make the methanol, and then you could use that methanol then ship somewhere else to a manufacturing site. So from a UK point of view, you can use that captured carbon to make methanol as a raw material to utilize in an existing plant.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very helpful kind of explanation of what something like flue to chem does. Thank you, and some of the opportunities around it. Rachel, what do you dream about getting to? What points are you aiming for when you're thinking about policy development?
So I think there's a couple of things that are particularly in sort of in conversation, if not in there's sort of more, where would you like to get to, rather than are we concrete in what we're going to do yet. I think there is definitely a piece about how do you build from the current chemicals footprint, right? So you've got huge infrastructure that does exist and that could potentially be repurposed, right? So, and the whole bit about how do you go from a lab scale chemical process to a full production plant is a non-trivial thing. It's not just you stretch it and it's a bit bigger, right? You have to go through the scaling pieces. So I think that's quite interesting and quite important that there is a national dialogue about what we can do with what we've already got in the country as part of how you do that transition piece. I think there's a huge amount that still needs to be done on how far can you push energy efficiency, resource efficiency, other decarbonisation for the existing piece. And there needs to be a real kind of place-based approach to how do we embed this in terms of, if you think about other security dimensions for the country, what is the security dimension component of the chemicals industry, right? In terms of the UK being internationally competitive, self-sufficient, great jobs. I mean, the heavy industry jobs do tend to be better paid than many other jobs, and that is an exciting thing for growth in this country. So I think we're looking at what you can do to be internationally competitive, what you can do to be sustainable, what we can do for things we need to use ourselves, right, for the UK economy, and making sure that we're not we're looking at what we could do not to be undercut by more polluting versions of those chemicals coming into the country. And then I think there's the big exciting opportunity that does need innovation and continued investment, which is quite hard, right? Is how do you build the new chemicals industry of the future? Because we know that we've got to get away from the hydrocarbon addiction, So there is going to be a need. You can't imagine the 21st or the 22nd century without the chemical products in them, right? So that opportunity, how do you get the innovation, get the scale, and then actually retain the benefits of that is one of the big challenges that I think the industry is looking at and that the government is very interested in.
Thank you. There's quite a few good questions appearing in the Q&A box. I think I'm going to turn to those now, and some of them kind of come back to the points we've been discussing a little bit as well. So the first one was pointing out that European gas is going to be twice the price of US gas because of the cost of LNG, and then asking how fast and how far can electrification cut UK chemical sector exposure to gas prices? Is it going to be fast enough to kind of be able to transition? Or are we going to see jobs disappear and then, I mean, maybe they might reappear, but with a low carbon future after that and less gas dependency. But yeah, what we've all talked about electrification a bit, and what certainly from Greenlight's perspective, we think it's very promising. We think sort of 70% or more of heat is in the kind of range that could be electrified. But I don't know, it'd be really good to hear from others on this question of kind of the speed at which that could be achieved and how much that would help. I don't know who wants to go first. Kind of wave at me a bit. Aaron, I'm going to pick you as the industry representative first of all.
I think in terms of electrification, I think we've got a lot of wind power in the UK. It's putting the infrastructure in place to take that wind power and actually put it to where it's needed. And I think in terms of I think that's encompassed in terms of, so we know where the industrial sites are, and actually getting that the electrification from the wind power to those sites and actually making sure that we plug in is a challenge. And actually LNG is cheap, but in terms of we have to work together in terms of getting those processes to make sure that we can run those sites at a cost efficient. So it's actually getting new processes. We don't have, BASF doesn't have a steam cracker in the UK. It has in terms of in Germany and in Antwerp, and we're looking at electrification for the steam crackers there. And so it is a big challenge, but we know we have to move away from fossil fuels in terms of natural gas and other fossil fuels in terms of that electrification. It will take time in terms of the technology has to be there. You have to build it up. And I think that also comes to John's point in terms of we need those people. So in terms of we've seen what's happening at some of the sites in the UK and then shutting down. Actually, we need those people in terms of who have the skills where we make the chemicals today to stay in the chemical industry to help that transition. And that's really vitally important in terms of moving away from LNG to electrification and actually upskilling those people in terms of those new processes. But actually, in terms of they're in the chemical industry, they know that. And actually, that's vitally important that actually we keep that supply chain of people who have that knowledge to help us that transition, and that transition is going to take time, though, Ross. I can't say it's going to be tomorrow, but we're working on it.
Rachel, any thoughts from your side on how quickly this might be achieved? Is this something that you think could be done at any speed, or is it going to be quite challenging?
I think at the moment everybody's very aware that there's three fundamental challenges here, right? So LNG is effectively the cheapest fuel at the moment, which is why it's widespread. That's, you know, well done, people, right? We've done a great job on backing out coal. We've got natural gas as the fuel, and now LNG is the cheapest route in, which makes it a challenge, right? So we're relatively competitive, I think, on gas prices compared to Europe, but as I think somebody put in the chat, compared to the US, that's going to be a massive distortion in prices, right? So that's one of the challenges about how are you competitive in the international markets, because chemical products tend to be extremely fungible, right? And chemicals is quite a cyclical business. So that is one of the challenges. It's always going to be about how can you get competitive on your energy costs, and you have to have supply. So there's a lot of work going on with the Clean Power 2030 mission to look at planning and connections and how we change grid connection timelines, because if you haven't got a grid connection, you certainly can't fuel switch, right? So there is a fundamental infrastructure piece that is acknowledged to be a really high priority that needs addressing, so that it can't take 10 years to get a connection, right? It just doesn't work. It doesn't solve your what am I doing about the electricity price itself, right? Because at the moment, even with really efficient electrification technologies, you'd still be paying a higher operating cost. And that is also something that is recognised and needs to be looked at. Right? It's hugely challenging because energy prices are a huge determinant for an energy-intensive industry like chemicals in terms of their competitiveness. But cheap energy and how you get to there through the transition does remain challenging. So I think that you see a lot of focus on energy affordability, but even more focus on how to get the connections done. But as one of your colleagues said, it'll get down from 10 years, but that's not the same as you can flick a switch and in 6 months' time you're good to go. We're nowhere close to that.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the next question, I was going to ask a little bit about the regional skills investment. This is one for John. The regional skills investments announced yesterday. Do those kind of things help? Wouldn't you think that's useful, or is there more to be done on that front?
Yeah, I think that certainly helps. I think that there's obviously a lot more that can be done and hopefully will. I think one of the issues that we've had on the skill side is so many different systems and funding mechanisms, and it's incredibly complicated. And how do we make sure that when workers are being trained initially, the qualifications they've had are recognised across not just one industry, but several industries, and so we've got very clear pathways of what qualifications are required for which particular jobs, and we're not having to, completely retrain people, partly just so they have that particular piece of paper when they do actually have a lot of those skills that are required in new jobs as well. I know that there is a lot of work going on in this area. I know, like from my previous experience when I worked in the energy sector, I think there's been some really good work done there. But it's an ongoing process, and I think the earlier we're able to do this, if you think of a particular chemical plant that may be at risk in 3 or 4 years' time, but isn't now, the earlier we can start, we can do this work at a practical level. It's better for the workforce, obviously, better for the company, but also it then gives that example that you can use in other parts of the industry that are affected.
Thanks, John. And we've been looking for kind of examples elsewhere of where this has worked in Europe, and that it's all about spotting issues early, isn't it? And kind of getting involved and as early as possible, and making sure that what you're doing is with communities and not just done to them. I've got another question that's come up a few times in different variations in the chat. And it's a bit different to what we've discussed before. It's about the kind of links to nature and the need to address the biodiversity crisis in tandem with the nature crisis. And then there's kind of two angles to that, I think. The question of, should we be producing chemicals in the same volume as we are at the moment, or could we be producing them more efficiently and getting away with kind of less of the chemicals as of all kinds of materials, really? But then also the question about forever chemicals and kind of how we address those as part of this decarbonisation process. Is there a way that we could be tying in the decarbonisation journey the industry needs to go on, along with kind of the need to make sure that the products are safe and sustainable as well? I'm afraid, Darren, I'm going to direct this one at you. I think probably as the first instance, because it's not so much a DESNZ capability. So.
And thanks, Ross. I think part of it comes with, in terms of how do we work with government on regulation and legislation of the chemicals to one, maybe remove those forever chemicals in terms of one in the environment, so chemistry can help remove them from the environment if they're already out there, and two, in terms of how do we then use innovation to replace those chemicals. And actually, why do we have those chemicals in the first place? Because they do a particular job. So in terms of how do then we replace those, so we're not contaminating the environment as we move forward. And these are challenges. They take time. It takes cost. And actually, your comment was, could we use less chemicals? But it's also supply and demand in terms of, yes, we can always make less, but actually people have to buy less also in terms of those processes. So it's a taking balance. So in terms of, if to use less in terms of, so using less, say, fossil fuels, raw virgin fossil fuels, yes, we can, and we are looking at that. And part of that goes into that circularity in terms of making sure that we recycle everything that we're using today, in terms of looking at going forward in terms of the development of the products we have. So whether it's in terms of automotive industry, so we're moving away from fossil fuels in terms of burning fossil fuels to electric motors, but then making sure we have those fully recycled in terms of, so we're not digging the metals out of the ground once the batteries are recycled. Looking at the cars in terms of at end of life, then the cars are not going to landfill. Actually looking at the plastics in terms of they're in the cars, can those plastics be recycled back into chemicals that can be used in a circular process? So we're constantly in the chemical industry looking at how we develop the materials and actually working with government to make sure that the legislation is right and we adhere to that legislation.
Thank you. Actually, I will bring Rachel in if that's okay, Rachel, because this is a big societal question as well, isn't it? As how we bring about behaviour change. Absolutely, as Darren says, if people are buying things and containing chemicals, that's not necessarily his problem alone to deal with. So how is government looking at integrating these questions around behaviour change and kind of the links between resource consumption and decarbonisation?
So if you're looking at where we are on a big level, right, it is very much the efforts that we're going to be making through the Circular Economy Task Force and the Circular Economy Strategy, right? Because that piece, I mean, I'm sure you're all aware, previously when there were attempts to, under the previous administration, there were attempts to suggest measures on behaviour change that didn't have societal acceptance at all, right? And in that context, you have to say, okay, so what can we do so that we are competitive and moving in the right direction? And actually, if we were to look across at some of our European neighbours, you can see how some of their policies on circular economy that have more local content, more reuse embedded in some of their the way that they actually implement policy and regulation is starting to divert where things get made and how things happen in a really constructive way. And I think you also see lots of grassroots things across the country where individuals are coming together to do more libraries of things, right? There is a genuine interest in how we can have good things, live well and use less. But it is something that is a whole society narrative that is needed, that is quite in contrast to this concept of unlimited resources, which is blatantly not true. We've only got one planet, right? And particularly if you get into biomass, it is a really, really constrained resource that needs to have a proper prioritisation. So do expect to see more coming also on what happens next after the government's biomass strategy.
Thank you, that's really helpful. John, did you have any thoughts in this area?
I think just briefly. So if you look at all of the chemicals that are currently produced, so there's some which are absolutely essential for the future. We can make them in a different way so that they're more sustainable. So this would be feedstocks. I think there'll certainly be some chemicals that we need to look at phasing out. There'll be new chemicals that we should be introducing. I think overall, I think supporting what Darren was saying about looking at ways of how can we reuse the chemicals that are being made. And I think just finally, it's just making sure that we don't have unintended consequences. So when say if I take the example of refrigeration, so like years and years ago, like things like methyl chloride used to be used for refrigeration. It's toxic, got rid of that, put in CFCs, and we know where that led. So there's also, whilst I recognise the urgency to remove certain chemicals as quickly as possible, it's also really important to make sure that whatever we're replacing them with isn't worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo that too. And actually, I think just to kind of go back to a little bit to the point though around kind of volume of chemicals and other materials, I think there's also a need to potentially look at new business models, because I can absolutely see that it might be sort of threatening to say let's use less of things, let's share, that kind of thing. But there are ways to kind of also make them work economically that I think we're only just beginning to have those conversations. So that's something I'd like to see happening myself much more. We've got time for one quick additional question. I wanted to pick up the one, it's a bit more technical, I'm afraid, but on carbon pricing and how that impacts the sector. I know that was brought up in the context of Grangemouth, and what the CBAM coming into force in Europe, whether that will have any effect, and kind of generally a bit of a discussion about the role of carbon pricing, I suppose, in all of this. I don't know who wants to go first on that. Rachel, would you be able to say anything on you did touch on the fact that you're not including the chemical sector in the CBAM to start with, but is there anything more you could say about the kind of reasons for that and what the thinking is?
Yeah, so I don't want to say that it can't be done, right? So when I said it's computationally quite challenging, that's when you start to talk about the thousands of different chemical products that there are out there, right? So that is a non-trivial problem. It's not a problem that can't be done, right? So don't think that the reason that we're not doing it is because it can't be done. I think there's also standing up a carbon border adjustment mechanism, getting it right, doing it as a behind the border tax is quite a complicated activity in itself. So don't think that the scope that we start with is the scope that we finish with, right? Is the CBAM piece, right? Okay. In terms of the carbon pricing piece, so I am the SRO for the UK emissions trading scheme, right? And I think the fundamental point about carbon pricing is if you look at it from if we knew exactly how to do decarbonisation, that is what we should do, right? But it still has to be an economic proposition for the business. So if things are economically irrational, businesses literally can't do them at scale on a sustained basis because then they go out of business. And I think that is part of the challenge that we've got with the cost of electricity on a relative competitive basis at the moment compared to the cost of natural gas. Because if you fuel switch, that is increasing your ongoing operating costs, right? And that's quite a hard thing for a business to do. If you look at carbon pricing, putting a price on the externality and actually saying that pollution has long-term impact, and therefore if you're going to do that, it's going to cost you more, is part of how, and as a national government, you can tilt the playing field towards low carbon alternatives and also create a market for those solutions, right? We get lots and lots of conversations about price. The current differential between the UK ETS price and the EU ETS price is quite significant, and it is in favour of UK businesses, right? And part of that is to do with how we set the net zero consistent cap, and we deliberately gave headroom to allow businesses time to adjust. Right? Now, we also get the counter argument that says if you had a higher price, it would make our investments more credible. So, but the price is set by the market, not by the government. So, if you have more specific questions, I'm happy to take a look, but maybe that helps a bit.
No, thank you. That's helpful. I don't want to get into an entirely a big detailed discussion, particularly at this point in on carbon pricing. I think that gives people a bit of a sense of some of the things you're grappling with. John, Darren, do you have any thoughts on carbon pricing before we wrap up? You can shake your head.
I suppose in terms of carbon price, yeah, I mean, we're always looking at where the carbon price is market set and adjusted, and I suppose with that we're also, when we look at the difference between the ETS system in the UK and in Europe, where we're always also then discussing with governments to make sure that how do we get that aligned, what is best in terms of, but also looking where our investments would sit compared to that and the cost. So it's a constant juggling, but we're always looking at then in terms of the product we're using and the products we're developing to make sure we have a low carbon alternatives which are coming out into the market. So I think we'll see some changes over the years. I'm sure Rachel will see this in terms of more discussions ongoing in terms of especially on CBAM going forward, and it'll be interesting to see in terms of where the prices will end up going forward.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. There are so many more things we could get into and discuss in more detail. So, but I think we're coming to the end of our time. So I'm going to turn to John first. John, could you maybe leave us with a final closing comment, or you could pick something that makes you feel optimistic to highlight?
Well, I've always got hope. So I do think that there is a potential pathway to not just reverse the decline of the sector, but also expand it in the future. And I do think that it's vital for other parts of the economy in terms of not just moving towards net zero, but growth in other parts of the economy. I think I'll just reiterate one of my earlier points, which was we need to have consent for this. We need to be listening to the workforce and their communities where these sites are, and make sure that they're involved at all levels. We really need to work on that consent for shifting the economy, and make sure that workers aren't missing out, and they also, you know, reap the benefits as well. I think we can do it, and I think if we can get a really good example, that will really help, not just for the chemical industry, but for other parts of the economy as well.
Thank you. Karen, you're next on my screen, so I'm going to ask you next. What would you say in conclusion?
I would say I'm eternally hopeful that we will move to net zero and get there in terms of, and I think chemistry will play a vital part in that role to move to net zero. I think from a purely UK point of view, I think the innovation infrastructure that we have in the UK is second to none, and I think that'll play a key part. And I think what we will need to do, and working with John's point, is make sure we have the right people with the right skills to make sure we implement that correctly. But I think in terms of, we are on the right path. It will take time and resources, but I'm confident that we'll get there.
Great, thank you. Rachel.
Just a huge thank you for your engagement, and I guess an appeal for continued engagement, right? There are incredible things that can be done. We learn by engaging and doing this collectively. I think there's such an important place-centric component to how we do this. And I am really encouraged by the recognition of, I mean, it's not surprising on a call with lots of chemists, which presumably means there's some engineers out there as well who are going, hang on a minute, how does this stack together? Isn't it better to do electrification? I think there are real things that we can do in this country, and ensuring that your voices are heard and that you're asking for things that you really need in order to be sustained, and also pushing STEM, because we're going to need a heck of a lot of engineers, and we need to have those great jobs and demonstrate that we can do this all over again in our next industrial revolution, right, where we actually deliver on the potential of net zero, is the reason that I'm still excited and coming into work every day.
Thanks, everyone. I started making a list of things, and they all started with P until you added STEM in there. But that was people and places, and actual firm plans in place as well. But I think there's lots of pieces of this puzzle need to come together. But I'm optimistic too. Let's finish on an optimistic note. I think, and as Rachel says, I think if we all, this hopefully will be a joint endeavour. If we can kind of cut across some of those boundaries and the tensions that maybe are very easy to put in place when people are kind of making changes, then hopefully that will help us all. Great. Thanks so much to our panelists for joining us, and thanks to everyone that's tuned in to listen. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to many of these issues again very shortly. Thanks, everyone.